This video made possible by the Global Innovation Exchange. Visit gixnetwork.org to learn more.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. How are you?
Welcome.
Good.
Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. It's good to be here.
Good. So can I be honest with you, since we're friends now, right?
Absolutely.
We've
We've had some, right, yeah.
When you were approached by Uber for this job, it sounded like a kind of an awful job. Taking over legal at Uber with everything that was going on at that company at the time. I mean, what convinced you, compelled you to do this?
Well, why do people climb great mountains, right? I mean, it was a huge, huge challenge. It was, look, I actually fell in love with Uber long before I ever thought about working for the company. When I was in Washington with the Justice Department, I discovered they rolled out Uber in DC, and I just fell in love with this idea that you could magically press a button and an SUV would show up, right? And so that idea of being able to bring mobility to places where, frankly, mobility had not been an easy option, that's a pretty compelling mission. And I was happy at PepsiCo. I was the general counsel at PepsiCo. It was fine. Things were going fine. But folks reached out to me, asked if I'd be interested. I had an opportunity to meet Dara Khosrowshahi, the new CEO. It was right after he started. And Dara kind of spun out this really compelling vision of a mobility platform that was all about how do we make the world move, and how do we do it while also doing the right thing. And as someone who spent half of his career at the Department of Justice, where you try to do the right thing every day, it was a pretty compelling proposition.
So to summarize, taking over legal at Uber at the time you did was the Everest of your career.
The Everest, well, I don't know if it's the Everest, but I will say it is fun climbing the mountain.
That's great. Well, speaking of climbing that mountain, you just reached a monumental settlement with all 50 states and the District of Columbia over a 2016 data breach that Uber covered up. Releasing information about that cover-up and the breach actually happened on your first day.
Yeah, it was quite I had a heck of a first day. My first day, most people are like getting to know their colleagues, they're getting their cubicle together. I was on the phone with state AGs from around the country saying, oh, hi, I'm Tony West, but today's my first day. I've got to disclose a data breach to you. We'd had this data breach in 2016. The good news, if there's good news to a data breach, is that the damage was mitigated immediately, so thankfully there was no real harm. But the bad news is it wasn't disclosed for over a year, and that's a problem. And so, if you're serious about this idea of being transparent, and I talk about the importance of being transparent, acting with transparency, acting with integrity, acting with accountability. If you're serious about those values and you really want to put those in play and you want to model those, then sometimes you got to do difficult things like call up state AGs and tell them you got a data breach. And so it was the right thing to do. Thankfully, less than 10 months later, we've been able to, since the disclosure, we've been able to resolve that with all 50 states, including the District of Columbia, and I'm pleased to have that one behind us.
Did you know that's how day one was going to go? Like, you're settling in, you're setting up pictures of your family, somebody knocks on the door, and it's like, so this thing happened? Or was it a plan, or was it a surprise?
Oh, no, I learned about the data breach about 48 hours before I was telling people about the data breach, and so it was very new to me. But, look, I knew that there would be big challenges. It was really part of what attracted me to the job. I had been very fortunate to have this career that spanned both public and the private sectors. So I thought I was well prepared to be able to take on some of the challenges that Uber presented. I knew there would be days when I'd open up the closet and a skeleton I hadn't anticipated might kind of tumble out. Luckily those days don't happen as often as they did when I first started. But there's still, great challenges. We've made a lot of progress, particularly on the cultural change work that we're doing, but still a lot of work to do.
Is anyone who participated in the decision to pay off the hackers and cover up that breach still at Uber?
I don't think so. Let me say that the individuals certainly responsible for that are no longer with the company, and I don't think anyone who was involved in the decision-making to do that is still with the company. That part I'm not 100% sure about, but very confident about the first part.
Okay. But even so, at least in the early days of Uber, breaking the rules, asking for forgiveness rather than permission was really written into the DNA. And most of the people at Uber, I would assume, grew up with that mentality. So with that initial culture, how do you right the ship? And is it even possible for Uber to scale and grow playing by the rules?
No, I definitely think it is. Look, I think, I don't believe that there's this choice you have to make between being compliant and being innovative. And in fact, when I think about some of Uber's greatest innovations, it actually comes in the compliance area, like insurance, which now allows peer-to-peer driving to occur in some of the innovations that we made there. But I don't think those are mutually exclusive at all. And I do think that there is magic that made Uber possible, made that disruption possible, made that innovation possible, and it was critical to its success. I believe you can still have the magic that underlies that and yet be a compliant company. Be a company that recognizes that there are allies that you can find in policymakers and stakeholders. Recognize that our success is tied to the success of cities, to sustainable cities, and to partnerships that we can build. Partnerships that frankly weren't really something we would think about in days past, like partnerships with taxi in some jurisdictions. So I think it's really a matter of harnessing that magic, harnessing that determination, yet recognizing that because we are now a global company, a company with a brand that has become a verb, it requires us to act differently in the world and move differently in the world.
One thing that strikes me is creating the kind of experience and service that you want to for drivers and for riders. I think about Starbucks and how it was really important for that company to create a consistent experience across thousands of stores. But Starbucks has employees. How do you create a professional and consistent experience and service when you have thousands of independent contractors who don't ultimately report to Uber in the same way an employee does?
Well, I think it's really interesting because Uber is both a global brand and a global company, but it's also a very local company. And I think actually that's part of its great success, that when you go to a particular jurisdiction, the drivers who will drive you from point A to point A, they're from that community. They're part of the fabric of that local jurisdiction. And that's a great strength, I think. That's true anywhere in the world. I think the other thing that is exciting about Uber is that it's not just a ride-sharing company. It's a mobility platform, which means that whether you're talking about bikes, you're talking about scooters, you're talking about integrating our platform in the landscape, the transportation landscape of a city, which means partnerships with cities and municipalities. That is also what Uber is, and that has to take on a very local flavor. That has to take on, a very indigenous quality in order to be successful.
So you're part of this new leadership at Uber, and there's been a lot of discussion about righting the ship in the post-Travis Kalanick age. But what actual evidence can you point to a changed culture other than these new leaders and ousting some of the people who are responsible for the more toxic elements of Uber's past?
Well, new leadership is a pretty big thing, right? When I think about my own leadership team, it's completely new. Hiring a foremost privacy expert to be our chief privacy officer. Hiring as my deputy general counsel the person who wrote the Holder report on the culture at Uber and what was necessary to change it. Hiring the senior most Department of Justice career official who recommended that Robert Mueller be appointed as the independent counsel to be our chief compliance and ethics officer, hiring the former head of the counterterrorism center, used to report to the President of the United States, President Obama, every day on the global terrorist threats that confronted the nation as our chief trust and security officer. Bringing in that talent and then allowing that talent to build their own teams, that's, I think, a big part, a big step in the right direction. But the other things, I think, is you just look at the proof is in the pudding. You know, when I joined, when Dara joined a month before I did, we had lost our license in London, a major market. We were not fit and proper, in the words of the license. You fast forward to today, we have that license back, and that's because there was a lot of personal diplomacy.
But it's a temporary license, right?
Well, I was going to say, we're still on probation. Yeah. We are still on probation, you know, and so I'm, you know, with all due respect, and so we have to fly right. But where we are today is a world away from where we were, you know, 10, 11 months ago. When I look at some of the things we've been able to do, whether it is, you know, settling the 50-state data breach matter, or you know, settling the Waymo case, which was a bet the company case when I joined, you know, doing things like stepping up to be a leader when it comes to ending mandatory arbitration for individual claims of sexual assault, being the first company to commit to publish a data transparency report on safety incidents, including sexual violence, on our platform next year. Those kinds of things, I think, demonstrate that this is a different company, moving in a different direction, but is, you know, one that understands what makes it, I think, such a great company to begin with, not forgetting that.
Can you give us a preview of what the metrics in that report on sexual assault and harassment are going to look like, what you're discovering?
Look, I mean, I'll tell you, part of what we're doing is working with women's advocacy groups, with sexual violence prevention advocacy groups to come up with a common taxonomy or a common language, lexicon, for how to categorize incidents on the platform. So, you know, one of the things I worked on when I was at the Justice Department was trying to, you know, prevent sexual assault on college campuses. And one of the challenges you run into with that issue is that law enforcement agencies all count the same behavior differently. Once, you know, everybody sort of agrees on what the definition of rape is, but then once you begin to talk about behaviors that aren't rape, it's very difficult to get agreement on how to categorize those things. And so it was always very difficult to compare apples to apples whenever you were dealing with that issue.
Particularly for U.S. lawmakers.
Particularly for U.S. lawmakers, exactly right. And so for the first time, we will now have, informed by advocacy groups, a common language, common categorization of incidents that we will use to be able to count incidents on our platform. And we hope, and we are inviting, and I'm spending a lot of time trying to convince other companies to join that effort, because as proud as I am of Uber sort of taking a leadership position here, I think, you know, Uber alone publishing numbers isn't going to be enough to actually begin to act against numbers like that and now have, you know, impact on reducing sexual violence.
But no specific instances from the reports you're working on to share.
So yeah, because we haven't actually come up with the common way to count it yet. I mean, that work is almost done. We expect that to be done hopefully within the next, I'd say, 60 days. But here's the one thing I will tell you. I mean, it's going to be no surprise. People were nervous when we decided to do this inside the company. I mean, how many lawyers in the company want to produce, you know, numbers like that, right? Because there's no good news story that can come from that. And so clearly this was, do we want to try to do something that we think is meaningful, is impactful, is the right thing to do? So we know that the numbers are going to be disturbing. And I think part of what we also know is that we will, you know, publish this report because, you know, any incident more than one is disturbing. We're not going to be happy with that. The second time we publish a report, those numbers will likely go up. And they will go up not because the platform is less safe, but because people will see that we are counting and we're paying attention, and that will encourage people to report. That is a good thing. But that will take some time to kind of acclimate people to that reality.
So you mentioned your time at the DOJ, and it sounds like there are quite a few Obama White House alumni at Uber now. Given that experience...
We're sort of in exile over in San Francisco, kind of all at Uber.
But given that experience, this is a watershed moment for big tech in DC. They're facing a ton of criticism, Uber included. Yeah. What do you think is going to happen with the Justice Department's investigations and with federal oversight over these technology companies that have been allowed to operate in sort of a Wild West environment up to this point?
Look, I think some of the criticism is well-founded. I think, one of the things that you learn coming from the data, my experience coming out of this whole data breach situation and then sort of observing what's going on, is that when it comes to data, and when it comes to people's privacy, you have to handle people's data in ways that users expect, right? It's not enough simply to say we have the check the box consent when you sign up for the app, and therefore, we have your consent. That's important. That's necessary, but it's not sufficient. You have to then, in the way that you handle data, you have to demonstrate you're acting in ways which meet users' expectations. I think that is a different bar. It's a hard bar because it's a constantly evolving bar, but I also think it's a reality of the world we live in. And so those of us who are entrusted with user data, and those of us who are entrusted with being able to facilitate movement or facilitate products or commerce using your data, we have to be very, very mindful of that.
Right, but some companies sort of operate under the understanding that they're going to use your data in ways that you probably wouldn't expect. Let's say like Mark Zuckerberg calls you up tomorrow, he makes you an offer you can't refuse, you are Facebook's new chief legal officer, what's the first thing you do?
Ooh, that's a tough question. That's a tough question. Well, fortunately, I haven't gotten that call. And since I don't have to engage in hypotheticals, all I will say is that, look, I think this is a really important moment for tech. It's a really important moment, and I think it's one that if it's handled correctly, it creates opportunities to create more trust, not less. But that's, it's all in how we react to this.
While we're in DC, and we won't stay here forever, most people probably don't know that you have a political celebrity in the family. Kamala Harris is your sister-in-law,
That's
right?
True. Yeah.
So, is she running for president?
I don't know. It's truth. I don't know. She hasn't made a decision. For what it's worth, I think she'd be a great president, but that's me. So.
Well, I imagine you'll have a lot to talk about over Thanksgiving. But what have you learned from her? I'll give you a question you can answer.
What have I learned from Kamala?
Yeah.
Well, I've learned a lot from Kamala. I think one of the things, we were both prosecutors at the same time. She was in the DA's office when I was in the U.S. Attorney's office. And the thing about, I think Kamala has demonstrated in so many ways that you can be effective in law enforcement if you recognize the importance of working with communities, particularly underserved communities, and building trust with underserved communities. And that extends to your being an effective public servant writ large. And so I think she's demonstrated over and over that by being someone who cares about reentry, by being someone who cares about communities that have been forgotten in many different ways, by being someone who's very forward-leaning and very progressive on law enforcement issues, that you can be an excellent public servant. And so there's just a little bit of familial pride in this. You'll excuse that. But,
just a little bit.
But no, I think I think it's a real model for, as we think about public service, what it means. I think she's definitely someone who cuts the right profile.
All right, let's circle back to Uber, the reason we're here. You're planning to go public next year.
Yeah.
So what happens if Lyft beats you to the punch, if Lyft goes public first?
I don't know if it's a race. Okay, I think, look, and I, I know there's a lot of talk and excitement and enthusiasm about, IPO. The only thing I'll say is that, when or whether, Uber goes public, the most important thing is that the company continues to execute and execute at scale. Because anybody who's gone through an IPO will tell you the most important day is not the IPO, it's the day after the IPO and the day after that and the weeks and the months that follow that in which you're really trying to prove that you can execute at scale and do so without missing a beat each time. And for a company that is not just a mobility company, but is also a company that is, is in the food delivery business with Uber Eats, is also a company that is in the autonomous vehicle space with ATG, is a company that is getting into the health delivery business with Uber Health. For a company that has many different platforms in which it's trying to tie together, execution is key.
Let's talk about autonomous vehicles, because I think the Waymo settlement with Alphabet's self-driving car unit, I think that came as a surprise to a lot of people. It's pretty unorthodox to settle mid-trial. I mean, you probably would know better than me, but why did it go down that way?
Why did we settle the case?
Mid-trial, yeah.
Well, look, I think you're always looking for opportunities to, resolve disputes. I'm much rather resolve things and build things than litigate. But look, I mean, I think, that case in particular, I think there was a lot of, it was freighted with a lot of history and baggage that...
Text messages.
Text messages, that, Dara and I we just didn't come to the table with. And so that created an opportunity, I think, not just to settle that case, but to increase Google's investment in Uber so that now we're partners and not adversaries.
What are some of the lingering implications, though? Because I know part of that has to do with agreeing not to use similar technology. Is it going to limit what Uber can do in self-driving cars?
No, it doesn't limit at all. And I think a lot of it is just assurances that Uber's technology is its own, which we've always been confident is true, and that it will continue to innovate using its own technology and its own IP, which we also believe has always been true. So, no, it's not a limitation. It does give assurances to both sides.
After the fatal accident in Arizona with a self-driving Uber, you said that it was a difficult journey to get to self-driving cars, but once we do, they will be safer than cars operated by humans. Mm-hmm. Are more fatalities inevitable along that difficult journey?
I would hate to say that fatalities are inevitable. I think when you look at the trajectory of autonomous vehicles, I think you can look at the trajectory of other industries, whether it's aviation. I think is a really good one to look at, and you will see there's always an evolution as the technology gets better and better. And I think that whole episode, one of the most important things that can come from that tragedy is, and our hearts still go out to that family, to Ms. Hertzberg and her family. The most important thing that come out of that are some real lessons about safety. And how do you create a safety culture? Make sure you're acting in ways which incentivize safety and safe decisions throughout the product development cycle. And so, you never want to have something like that happen, but if it does happen, you want to make sure you're taking all of the lessons that you can. And so that's why, within 48 hours of the accident, we ordered a top-to-bottom safety review, hired Chris Hart, who was a former NTSB chair, to conduct that review. They've just now are finishing up the report. We're going to release that to the public, which is not the typical thing that a company would do, but we think it's important that people learn from what has happened with us, and we think it'll make the industry safer and better.
Given those changes, are you confident that it won't happen again?
Well, I'm certainly, confident that we have a safety culture and are developing a safety culture that will minimize the chances of that ever happening again. But I can't predict the future, unfortunately.
One thing that I think is fascinating about this new chapter at Uber is moving so far beyond cars and these conversations about creating an app that lets you get bikes, scooters, public transit, really this on-demand mobility app. And I'm just curious, particularly around the public transportation element of it, if Uber will be able to partner with cities when the company took such an adversarial approach in the beginning.
Oh, I think absolutely we can. And I know that because we are partnering with cities now. They're just in ways that perhaps aren't as visible. But last week, for instance, is a good example. We have something called Uber Movement, which gives us insights based on real-time data of how traffic is occurring in cities, how cars are driving and whatnot. And those insights are excellent tools for helping to build sustainable communities and sustainable cities. I used to be on a planning commission, for instance, and I know that one of the things that we would pay lots of public money for were these traffic studies to tell us how traffic would move if we decided to do housing in one area, or if we decided to put a church over here or something. What would that do to the traffic flows, and then what impacts would that have on neighborhoods and communities, on the safety of those neighborhoods and communities? That's data that we are getting in real time now and are sharing with cities. And last week we announced we were sharing it and the insights from that data with the city of Seattle. Those are partnerships that are really important. We have another partnership, in fact, that we're with the county, where we're looking to provide the last mile between that last public transit stop and someone's home, and to provide safe rides for people there. So there are all kinds of ways in which cities and Uber can partner together in ways that I think will enhance the quality of life for people in communities and cities. I think one thing that's really, you've got me on a roll now, I'm sorry.
Please.
I'm just thinking, like one of the things that was counterintuitive to me that I learned in this job is that when you take a city like Seattle and you look at where our fastest growth is, it's not in the core. It's in North Seattle, in places like Victory Heights, in places like Wedgwood. It's in South Seattle, in places like South Beacon Hill. In Brighton, it's in traditionally underserved communities. That's where we're growing the fastest. That's where the business is really experiencing real dynamic growth. And what that tells us is that there's a real hunger for access to mobility in those communities. If you go to New York City, the same thing. Most of our rides don't go into Manhattan. Most of our rides go point to point in the outer boroughs. And that's where over half of our business is growing the fastest.
But don't you think there might be a concern that Uber and Lyft disincentivize the city from doing its job and providing reliable public transit to those locations? I mean, there's been studies that show in the urban core, Uber and Lyft are actually contributing to traffic, and the more affordable options like Lyft Line and Uber Pool discourage people from taking public transportation. It just seems like there are some more complicated equity dynamics that could be at play there.
Well, I don't know if I would agree with the premise, only because there's a reason why we're growing in those areas. It's because they're not currently being served. And yes, I guess people could wait for policymakers to come up with a bond that would fund over 20 years the construction of the extension of. I dealt with this. I'm from San Jose, and I dealt with this when I was growing up. There was a whole debate about BART in the San Francisco Bay Area and whether or not it would actually go around the entire bay. And BART never came to San Jose, where I grew up, because people couldn't agree on how to fund it and how to build it. Public transportation systems cost a lot of money. They're huge capital-intensive infrastructure projects. I don't know if we should expect people in underserved communities to simply wait until folks get it together. I think the fact that you're seeing the demand in those communities, and I think the fact that people are exercising options to be able to have access to mobility like that, that's a good thing. And I think it ought to encourage more, frankly, it ought to encourage more partnership and more communication and more working together, not just Uber, but rideshare generally and cities, so that we can make sure that this mode of transportation, this option, is a part of the transportation landscape that communities offer.
We're running out of time, but I'm going to ask you one more question.
Sure.
After everything that's happened, why should anyone trust Uber?
Why should anyone trust Uber? Well, look, we need to earn that trust every day. Look, the brand proposition is trust. All I can say is, if you deleted Uber, give us another chance. You've got new leadership in the company, and I would say also look at not just what we say, but look at what we actually do, and then judge us by our actions as well as our words. I think you'll be pleased with what you find.
All right. Tony West, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.